Good afternoon and welcome to this session at the Literary Translation Centre on editing translations from Chinese and Japanese. My name's Kate Griffin and I'm International Programme Director at the British Centre for Literary Translation, which is based at the University of East Anglia. And I'm delighted to introduce my fellow panellists. On my far left is Elizabeth Foley, who's Publishing Director of Harvill Secker. Next to her is Eric Abrahamson, who is a literary translator working from Chinese into English and is also one of the founders of Paper Republic, which he'll no doubt talk about at some point. To my right is Joe Lusby, who is Managing Director of Penguin China and General Manager of Penguin North Asia. And on my far right is Michael Emmerich, who is a renowned literary translator from Japanese and teaches Japanese literature at the University of California in Santa Barbara. So we've got a wealth of experience on the panel, and what we want to talk about really is the joys and the challenges of editing translations from Japanese and Chinese into English. I thought I would start with the translators, with Eric and Michael, and I wanted them, by way of introduction, to talk about their experience of translating, a little bit about what they have translated, and maybe about the peculiarities and specificities of the language and what kind of challenges that they face when translating and whether they have any examples of this. So maybe, Michael, if you want to kick off.
Okay. Can you all hear me? Okay. Michael Emmerich. I translate, basically I specialize in books that don't sell. I have a very, I don't know where I developed this ability, but I have an uncanny ability to choose books that no one else will want to read, and I translate them and publish them, and then nobody buys them, and that's the end of the story. I've translated a wide variety of different writers. The first book I did was by Kawabata Yasunari, the first Nobel Prize winner in Japan, a collection of short stories. I've done a number of books by Yoshimoto Banana, or Banana Yoshimoto, a fairly well-known writer. In Japan, read mostly as chicklet, but not read as chicklet, fortunately, in English. I translated a book by Takahashi Genichiro called Sayonara Gangsters, which is a really weird kind of postmodern romp. Most recently, let's see, I did a book called Manazuru by Kawakami Hiromi Kawakami, which has very, it's a kind of dense, poetic novel. And then after that, a book by somebody named Furukawa Hideo, which is basically a history of the 20th century, or mostly the latter half of the 20th century, told sort of from the perspective or centered on war dogs. So kind of all over the map in terms of the different styles of translation I've done. But yeah, all books that don't sell. In terms of, I feel a little strange participating in this panel actually, because for the most part, the books I've translated have not really been edited. So it's been, and I think, I'm not sure to what extent my experience is representative of translators from, say, East Asian languages into English. But until, so a couple of the books I've published were funded by an organization called the Japanese JLPP, the Japanese Literature Publishing Promotion, something like that. Organization, and they actually hire an editor. So I did have, for 3 of the books that I did for them, I had an editor hired by this basically Japanese governmental organization. All the other books, editors basically just took what I handed in and published it. They would maybe, change a few words here and there, have a copy editor change things, which then I would change back, things like that. So it was really pretty minimal. So I'm kind of interested to hear other people's experiences. I suspect that in some ways my experience is not typical, but perhaps it is.
I was wondering, why do you think that your translations weren't edited? Was it because the translation was perfect in every way? Or do you think it was that they were nervous of editing and assumed that you as translator would know best? Because did the editors that you were working with, did they know Japanese?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing is when this JLPP hired editors, or actually it was always the same editor. I kind of asked to work with the same person every time. And he doesn't really know Japanese all that well. He knows some Japanese, but he worked in Japan for a long time and has a great knowledge of and love of Japanese literature and Japan. So he kind of felt that he could do it. I kind of wonder, if the editors I was working with at American publishers or sometimes British publishers just felt like, I don't think it was because the translations were they felt, we couldn't touch a word. It's so if we touched a word, the whole book would crumble and it might sell many copies. I don't think it was that. I think it's probably more that they felt like either maybe contractually they had to maintain a faithful translation or something, and so if they came in and fiddled with the translation, that would actually somehow put them in a bad position vis-a-vis the original and whoever held the rights. I don't know. Could be that, or it could have been that they just felt that because they didn't know the context, they should leave it up to me, or they didn't know enough about Japanese literature to. I suspect we'll have other ideas about what the reasons might have been.
So what about you, Eric? Do you want to talk a little bit about your experience of translation, and also, do you get edited?
Yes, and I edit. I'm in sort of an odd position. I wear many hats and play many roles with different people. So I'm not nearly as experienced as my colleague in Japanese there. I've really only translated one novel into English. Countless short stories, but one novel, Civil Servant's Notebook, which Joe over here is publishing. And I've been lucky. I've certainly heard horror stories about totally unedited translations or editors who really look at a translated novel and have no idea what to do with it. So far I've been lucky, I haven't been in that position at all. Penguin hired an editor to work with the book that I was translating, somebody who also spoke Chinese. And so we got to have long, detailed conversations about phrases and words and how this should be translated and all that sort of thing. So in addition to my own translations, my little song and dance moment here. I'm one of the editors of this magazine, which none of you were at the event for this afternoon. This is Pathlight Magazine. This is something, I'm kidding, that I and a few other colleagues are doing in conjunction with a Chinese literary magazine in China. So it's sort of a, unfortunately, government-funded channel for promoting new contemporary Chinese writers abroad in English. This is only issue 2, so we're right at the very beginning of it, but it's been an interesting experience because everybody on the editorial board is also a translator, was originally a translator. And so the potential for, going down garden paths and getting caught in the weeds by the side of the building is just intense. We have these back and forths with the translators about, well, I would have done it differently. And they said, well, you didn't translate it. And we're like, well, maybe I should translate it. And so we have really interesting, from a translator's point of view, arguments about what goes into the magazine, but it gets a little entangled. But it's fun. I think there's a real pleasure in being an editor who is also a translator, and to see the thought process of some other translator when you compare the original to the translation, and then getting engaged in those discussions, and then trying to decide where accuracy shades into style, and where it's time for you to back off and say, that's not what I would have done, or I think it could be done better, but you've chosen this voice, you've chosen this style. I'm not gonna mess with it. So that's sort of basically the position I'm in. I love sort of coming at it from all directions.
Liz, maybe it would be a good moment for you to talk about your experience, which is from the other side as an editor rather than as a translator.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'd say it's interesting hearing what Michael says, because Harvel Secker publishes a lot of Japanese writers, but usually the way that we come across Japanese writers historically has been via American publishers. So the primary editing is actually usually done in America, and I think I'd say as a general rule, Harvel Secker publishes more than half the list is in translation from various different languages. And every book has a different editorial process. And that depends partly on whether or not the editor knows the original language. I know no Japanese whatsoever. So for example, I was editing an Italian book and I can orientate myself in Italian, so that naturally means that I go slightly deeper if something sounds wrong than I would do in a Japanese book where the trust of the translator is paramount. But I certainly know that my colleagues in the US have done very kind of stringent edits on Japanese books on certain things. I mean, I think one of the famous examples is that the Wind Up Bird Chronicle has 2 chapters that exist in the Japanese that don't exist in the US version and the British version because they were cut by the US editor. So I think it does depend book by book and editor by editor, so there's no one kind of hard and fast rule. And certainly what I'm primarily doing when I'm editing in a language that I don't know is reading for flow in English, and that's my kind of focus. And there's a huge amount of trust that you have with the translator to actually have replicated the book in, as it is. So.
And how much contact do you have with the translator as you're editing?
A lot,
and
yeah.
with the original writer as well?
A lot with the translator. Quite often our translators are the people who are in touch with the author, so it sort of goes down that line. I mean, it depends, because we're also in touch with the author and their agent or representative separately. But on matters of kind of editorial choice, quite often the translator is the person who is having that discussion and that dialogue with the author. I mean, some of our authors have kind of amazing translation seminars where all of their translators from different languages come and sit with the author in a room for, several days, and they go through word by word for everybody. And that's a wonderful thing when that can happen, but obviously that's going to grass. That's not necessarily everybody.
And Joe, do you want to talk to us a bit about your role in this process?
Sure. In China, with Penguin, we publish a small list of books. Penguin publishes Chinese writers quite widely around the world. But out of China, we now have a new list of books where we publish between 8 and 10 books a year, or we're acquiring 8 to 10 books a year on and from China that we can publish in English. Those books are a mixture of books written originally in English on China, and it's roughly half and half. Half the books are basically non-fiction written in English and fiction written in Chinese that we then translate into English. The main reason we decided to do this was actually not so much about the editorial and publishing process so much as the marketing and promotion of author process. We felt that by signing up Chinese writers and taking them halfway around the world into a country where they didn't have a network, they didn't have contacts, they didn't speak the language, and they were not physically close and there, it was very difficult to promote Chinese writers and launch them in the UK and the US. And so instead we would sign them up in Beijing, we would publish them into the Asia-Pacific region first, where it's much more their home territory. They can do events, they can do interviews, they can build the profile, we can build the books locally, and then we can take them outside when there's already a sense of awareness and knowledge. So we made that decision much more from a sort of marketing and building authors perspective. What we actually then subsequently have found through the process, and actually particularly the book that Eric worked on for us, Civil Servant's Notebook, that was a particular example of a book that I think I realized there was an added benefit, which was at every stage of our publishing process, everybody who works on the book speaks both languages. And I hadn't really thought that was a benefit when we got into this, but it gives us a lot more confidence when we're getting into the editing process, because then you have to respect the original work and you have to make sure that you're accurately and fairly representing what the author says. And of course, you have a lot more confidence. Some books need a lot of editing, and some books in particular, I'd say, Civil Servant's Notebook is a very complicated and very avant-garde style in many places, and there are some things that just in translation it's very difficult to do. And it's, to be frank, I think any book needs a very good editor, and I think it's almost unfair on translators to expect them to be working hard on a translation and then expect them to then edit the book for us as well. If it was originally an English book, I wouldn't expect the author to then edit the book themselves. So that's actually been a real benefit, and I think it does make the books a lot stronger. And I would also say possibly the one difference between Chinese and Japanese that we possibly have is that there is not a strong recent tradition of editing books in China. I think a lot of the books that we see that have been published by Chinese publishers are at a stage which a British publisher would probably consider to be more a manuscript than a finished book. I think the books themselves needed work. that we would have done. And so to actually take on a Chinese book and assume that you cannot touch this is maybe you're doing a disservice to the book, that the book is still on a journey and there is more you could be doing with it. And we always talk to the authors, we always make sure the authors are okay with what we want to do, and invariably they're very happy. It's the first time they've been edited quite rigorously, and they tend to really get into the process with us. And so it tends to be very collaborative, as Eric felt, working with our editor, working with our in-house team, and then also talking back with the author.
Yeah,
Maybe you could comment on that, Eric.
it was also interesting because I was given the original Chinese manuscript to translate from, so we were sort of going back a step in the editing process to start over. I think with the probably correct assumption that we would put more time and thought and energy into editing the finished work than the Chinese publisher had. And I just to sort of go off of what Joe said, the major lesson that I've learned both as a promoter of Chinese literature and a translator, and now as an editor of other people's translations, is there's no sort of one point at which the book becomes some sacred object that no further work can be done on, or it must be left exactly the way it was. And I think as long as all the participants in the process are respected, the author in particular, you need to talk to them about what you're doing and have them agree, then really all bets are off. I mean, if anyone feels they can bring something to the book that'll make it better, then why not? And so I sort of started out with this idea of, the translator doesn't touch the work. The translator just very faithfully replicates what's there and then steps back from it. And I've come through this whole process to think about it very differently. Like as long as you're careful and as long as you're respectful, I think it's absolutely a good idea to get your hands dirty and participate a little.
So actually, I think the difference you were suggesting between Chinese and Japanese probably doesn't hold. The same thing is I think quite true of publishing in Japan. That editors, this was not always true. It certainly wasn't true, say, in the pre-war and then post-war for a few decades. There were editors who would actually say, take texts that weren't finished and finish them, or write things and attribute them, or say that they had been written by this author or something like that. That kind of happens sometimes. But now, for the most part, editors in Japan go and get the manuscript and bring it back, and that's it. Or they go and sort of harass writers to make sure that they're writing the things that they're supposed to be writing. So frequently you do have the same kind of thing happening where Japanese writers will be translated for the first time, and if an editor does look at the English text, that'll be the first time that it's really been edited. And Murakami Haruki, right, this famous example of the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, which was, I think the contract, as I understood it, said that this very long book cannot be more than 500 pages in English, and the book was definitely going to be more than 500 pages, so the translator, J. Rubin, being a very conscientious translator, translated the whole thing, and then went through and, because he cared a lot about the work, kind of trimmed it down himself rather than leave that to somebody else. And then Murakami, and of course, he's working with Murakami and checking to make sure that everything is okay. And Murakami says, yeah, everything is okay. In fact, you know what? In the paperback version, I'm going to adopt some, though not all, of the changes that you've made to the Japanese. So the Japanese paperback edition incorporates some of the edits that were made in the English edition and is thus different from the Japanese hardback edition, right? Then in terms of this, the notion that you don't want to get your hands dirty and so on, I'm an academic, and academics, for whatever reason, tend to be kind of often maniacally purist, and they assume that, there is a text that is, it's sort of up there and kind of glowing like an orb in the sky, and you cannot touch it. It has to be maintained in all its wonderful, glorious purity. And that's kind of how I saw things until I was edited for the first time. And I was actually working, all 3 times, as I said, I've worked with the same editor when I've really had done some serious editing. And for this first book, the editor really didn't like the book and suggested, for instance, changing the ending. He said, this ending is atrocious, we've got to change it. And he would go through, and we were using the comment function, and he would have like, what the fuck? Question mark. And that would be his comment, like, can we please do something about this? And so on. So he was very, he had a bad reaction to that first book. Then the other, like the second book, I'd go through 10 pages and he would say, you used this word 5 pages ago. Another word? possibly. And it was like a really surgical process, so a very different process. But anyway, as a result of that first translating experience, where we were kind of disagreeing quite a lot, I came out thinking, gee, this is an incredibly valuable experience. I had this kind of purist approach. The editor had a totally different approach, and we kind of battled it out. So what I did before the book came out, I took my original, my first draft, and then the edited version, and sent them both. There was a journal called Calc that came out for a very short time. It's now defunct or online. But when it was coming out, I sent them both. I sent them both versions and said, "Would you be interested in publishing these?" And they said yes. So we published the unedited first draft and then the edited draft, which were quite different. And got this furious letter from somebody who was saying, like, how could you do this? We read translations because we want to understand how foreign people think or something like that, like the kind of flow of their thought, and to edit this is, it's blasphemy and so on and so forth. So I think, that question of how, getting your hands dirty, right? The notion that there is a kind of dirty side to editing is really important when you're talking about translations, and the extent to which it's a good thing, a bad thing, the extent to which, particularly in the case of East Asia, because the editing is not happening necessarily in the original context, these are all very, very important issues that need to be discussed more. Hence, here we are.
Liz, from your point of view as an editor in the UK, do you change endings, or do you regard the text as the sacred, or what's your view when you're editing?
If we had a book where we felt that the ending was weak, then we would definitely suggest changes on that level. That would be, normal. What we would always do, obviously, is have the conversation with the author, and we do get a lot of feedback from readers where they object to things that they have perceived to be different in the original language and in the English translation. And there's also a certain weight that comes with producing the English translation, I think, because it's used for so many other things. Other languages translate from the English translation of books. Film scripts are made from the English translation of books. So it's a really kind of important translation just because of English being such a big language. But yes, certainly every book, be it a translation or not a translation, you want to make it the best book it possibly can be. So I don't think there would be a kind of limit on what you would feel you could suggest. It's just who wins the argument if the author objects. And we've certainly been in that situation before where serious structural changes have been suggested, complete reorganizations of timeframes and things like that, and things have run aground because the author has said, look, I've written this book, I've finished it, I'm done with it, and it exists as I planned it to exist, so I'm not prepared to go this far. We have also had situations where we've had books come in from translators and the translator has chosen to make those changes and the author has objected, and that's not something that's come from the editor, it's come from the translator making that choice. So, everybody does respond to these texts in different ways, I think, and feel different levels of kind of control over them. But ultimately it's the author's book, I think, is what we feel.
Can I jump in? Structure and story is one thing, but I think something that's particularly pertinent to Chinese and Japanese, I assume Japanese, I don't speak any Japanese, is just the fact that the languages are so completely different from English. So if you're changing the shape of a story, that's one thing, but when you're translating, you're making such a leap from one language to another. There's very, 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 very little in common between Chinese and English. From grammatical structure, sentence structure, idioms, habits of expression, even like the metaphorical associations attached to fruit or animals or something like that. Everything is so different that any given translation of an original Chinese is going to be just widely different. And you can say these are two completely valid, accurate translations of this Chinese, but they're just very different from each other. And I see arguments about translation out of like German or French, and you can't help feeling like, well, boy, you guys got it easy. I know you don't, but it looks that way. It's like, do we want to use this adjective or that adjective? And we're like, God, are you kidding? We're dealing on the question of, do I rearrange the sentence this way or do I rearrange it that way? So just in terms of language, I think you're already cut so free from the original that it sort of pushes you in that direction to sort of just say, well, I'm making up a voice here, so why don't I just, take it a step further or a half step further?
I heard an interview a while ago that Michael Ondaatje gave, and he was being asked about how he felt about the film adaptation of The English Patient, where Anthony Minghella had made quite substantial changes to the story as it went. And this wasn't a translation, well, it's a translation, but it's translation from book to film rather than between languages. And he was asked how he felt about what Anthony Minghella had done to the story. And Michael Ondaatje said that he felt that Minghella had explained the process in terms of, for him, that the screenplay process was a question of you have to preserve the taste in your mouth at the end of the process. So if you got to the end of watching The English Patient and the taste in your mouth, the feeling that you had, the emotional journey it took on was the same as the journey that you had been on with the book, then it was a successful adaptation. And how you got yourself there is just a question then of interpretation. And I think that's a very nice way of thinking about it. Certainly when I'm thinking about respecting the original work and how far am I prepared to take something, again, I often find myself coming back to this analogy of the taste in your mouth. As long as the reader sits back at the end of the book and has had a fairly similar emotional experience, then I'm reasonably happy with the choices that we've made.
Liz, I wanted to ask you about this because you're reading the book in English and you said you don't have any Japanese. Can you sense these differences in concept and structure, and how do you deal with that?
In the language, I think you sort of pick up things that you think might be issues, like the obvious one that everybody talks about from when translating into English from a lot of languages is repetition, and how when you're editing translations you quite often come up with repetition just because of the way that vocabulary works in different languages. The other thing that I quite often find that I'm interested to ask actually Michael about is things like tenses, because that seems not to be quite as straightforward when I'm reading translations from Chinese and Japanese necessarily. That's something that seems to come as a certain amount of confusion about tenses sometimes, is an issue that we've come across. So there are little kind of things that you think, okay, this is maybe indicating something in the language that I don't know about, but it's not flowing in English in the way that I would want it to, and perhaps this is pointing to something that's very different in the concept of language between these two. But I don't know if that's if there are things you come across that are particularly detailed issues about Japanese that make it difficult to translate it into English.
I don't know if there's a question of, the line between difficulty and pleasure is so non-existent that I don't know if I could answer that. But in terms of tense, for instance, tense, and then also to say, with Japanese in particular, indirection. So instead of saying, oh, it's a beautiful day out, it seems to be a beautiful day out, that kind of thing. You get a whole lot of it seems to, he appeared to. Yeah. Also, you can't, adjectives fundamentally in Japanese can't be used. You can't, adjectives are fundamentally first person, so you can't say he was happy. You can only say he seemed happy, because the adjective itself, like ureshi, it can only refer to the speaker. Tenses also in Japanese, basically there aren't. I'm not a linguist, and I think linguists maybe still debate this a little bit, but there aren't tenses in Japanese. You have aspect. Chinese also, right? No tenses. So you said that there tends to be a fair amount of confusion. I always try and make my usage of tense in translations as confusing as possible, and will intentionally jump back and forth between tenses all the time, because actually people do that in English too, right? And I think translators tend to exploit only, or there's a certain amount of pressure that's put on translators somehow to exploit only, say, 30% of the resources available to them in English. And so just as a way to kind of fight against that, I'll mess things up.
Do you want to talk a little bit, Eric, about any sort of specificities of Chinese that you come across when you're translating?
I think the hardest thing, what I just said about sort of the distance between the two languages, as long as you can get a translator who's willing to make that leap, sort of, because especially for new translators, the tendency is always to huddle close to the original language because you feel safe there, and you don't want to sort of leave the nest. Anyone with a certain amount of experience is going to be a little more willing to step away from that, and I think that's I think that's fine. That's just something that comes with time. I think that we have more trouble with storytelling conventions and literary conventions between Chinese and English than we do with language problems. Because the language problems are basically, there's some like, there's these chengyu, there's like idioms that almost always come out as a cliche in English, whereas in Chinese they're sort of brilliant and lovely, and they're like a little flower that you've pinned to your book, pinned to the text. But when it comes out in English, it sounds sort of foolish. So you get away from that sort of thing. But the storytelling conventions, I don't know if it's an actual oral tradition or a faux oral tradition that a lot of contemporary Chinese writers are drawing on. So book after book after book starts. It all happened back in 1963 when I was still a boy, and then the unimaginable happened. And then there's all these little sort of key phrases and sort of story setups, and at first it's sort of folksy and quaint, and then you start to think, oh God, please just like give me a stream of consciousness. So there's a lot of stuff like that. There's also an incredible tolerance for sentimentality, and I think a lot of Chinese readers go to books hoping to be moved, which is fine. It's not why I read, but I mean there's just a real willingness to put up with a lot of very heavy-handed manipulation of the sensibilities of the reader, and people are like, it's sort of like a goal to be crying by the end of the book, and that's like a phrase of high praise for a lot of books. There were tears running down my face by the end of the book, and we sort of think, oh God, not another one of these. Like, just get this maudlin stuff away from me. But when it's done right, obviously, something that's emotionally moving in a good book will move anyone who reads it. So that ends up being more, not how you translate, but what you choose to translate, because there are stories that you just think the thing that appeals here will never appeal to a Western reader. There's also a lot of sort of nostalgia for rural past, because sort of China's rural past is very near, and a lot of people feel like social changes have wrenched them bodily out of that kind of rootedness in a village or a countryside or a rural way of life. So a lot of stories just turn on the whole emotional impact of the story is, I left my home and my grandparents are still back on the farm and I'm in the city and I'm lonely and sad. And you can take that somewhere, but you can't. That's not enough to really just float a whole story. Or the sense of like, I made my mother unhappy by not doing what she wanted me to do. And maybe Western readers look at that and be like, and so what? Good on you. Whereas Chinese readers are like, oh, it just hits them. It hits them. They're like, Jesus, I know that feeling exactly. So that sort of thing just comes out, like with the magazine, what we choose. We'll say, well, we're going to have such and such a writer, and then we get 4 or 5 short stories from that writer, and it's pretty obvious, which ones we think will be most successful in English.
Joe, maybe this is a good moment for you to talk about what you choose to be translated, and also to talk. You mentioned earlier the lack of editing recently in the Chinese publishing industry, and why that is, and what effect that has.
Well, I mean, to take the second part first, I think the reason editing hasn't happened is much more commercial than cultural reasons. Chinese publishing has been run as a state-owned sector for non-profit and for the enlightenment and entertainment of the masses until only about between 8 and 10 years ago. And as publishers now have to become more and more, so then there was this sense of worthy publishing rather than necessarily the highest possible literary values. And actually going back to what Michael was just saying, actually again in China in pre-1949 days, there were iconic editors. There was a really robust sense of editorial. So culturally it's not a sense that this is just a society that doesn't believe in editing. I think it's just, in the old days it was just not a priority. It was about the message, the revolutionary credentials of a message. And that was sort of the editing process, if you like. And then more recently, I think the publishers, their margins are just getting squeezed so tight that they're not so inclined to invest in that side of things. But that is changing, and what you're seeing is particularly people who sort of self-edit on the internet and groom their own writing and sort of evolve as writers like that. I mean, I do think a lot of the younger writers often have much greater discipline. They're used to writing shorter works, and short's always nicer than long oftentimes. It takes a lot more discipline to write something in a much shorter form. So I think these sorts of internet habits are going to certainly help. steer this onto a slightly different course. In terms of how we choose the books we buy, I mean, there is never one answer. I mean, basically we choose what we like and what we think we can do a good job with. I typically, my general sort of answer, my standard answer is that I need the book really to be two things. I need to feel that this is a story that is best told from a Chinese perspective. The Civil Servant's Notebook is written by a man who used to be a civil servant in the Chinese government and now writes political fiction in Chinese that's published by Chinese publishers, and it's all about political corruption and officialdom, and they're beautiful, funny, ridiculous books. We're publishing a book next month by Sheng Ke, who's here at the fair. And this is a story called Northern Girls, about the first wave of domestic migrants who went from the Chinese countryside to the cities. This novel is set in Shenzhen in the 1990s. And she writes from a very strong sense of experience. So on the one hand, I look for books that read convincingly. They tell a very strong story that really tells from a perspective that only a Chinese person can really have experienced. But on the other hand, it has to have universal values and universal themes in it. I don't want to just take on books that are preserved in aspic and are from a different country in a disparate place, and it's just somewhere over there that exists in a time lost in history or in a context that's not relevant. I want the book, Northern Girls is an innocence to experience of a young girl moving out from her home and into a new city. Civil Servant's Notebook is just really, really good, down and dirty political corruption fiction. I mean, I can describe these books in ways that it's not actually defined by its Chineseness, and that for me is very important because I want these books to have appeal on their own terms, not just as curiosities from China.
Michael, do you have anything? Could you talk a little bit about the difference with Japanese literary traditions? Whether that's something in the way that Eric was talking about the sort of the different styles of storytelling in Chinese. Are there similar issues in the sort of the traditions of Japanese writing that you come across?
I'm not sure. Japanese writers have been so intensely engaged with writing all around the world since the 1870s, 1880s, that I'm not sure, and I'm sure that's true, of course, in China as well. But I'm not sure I could give quite, identify what it is that or if there is one particular thing or even a couple of particular things that could be identified as setting Japanese literature apart from a lot of what's being written in, say, English. But there definitely, I agree that there really is, or in the case of Japanese literature, there is kind of a different range. I mean, maybe you could say that, the concept of literature, what literature is, only overlaps to a certain degree with writing in English, which causes enormous problems. I think, this is, you look at, say, literary prizes that are awarded specifically to translations, say in the US there's the Penn Translation Prize. I think there's one Chinese book in the, 50 years that the prize has been awarded. There's one Chinese book. There are two Japanese books. No Korean books. It's, from my perspective, ridiculous. And I kind of wonder, and these are, translators who are choosing these books. So it's people who are interested in translation. And I've always kind of wondered why that is. And it's not, I don't think it's that, say, the people who are sitting on these boards are prejudiced against like East Asian writing or something like that. I think it's more that, the concept of literature, right? There's this very kind of clear sense that, say, literature is not maudlin. Right? If it's maudlin, or rather, if it's maudlin, it's not literature, it's something else. But in China, it is. Or in Korea, it is. Like maudlinness, what we would call maudlinness is a positive thing, right? In the case of Japanese fiction, repetition, right? Having things that seem incredibly repetitious, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? If you like a book, what's wrong with having it be a few pages longer? If you kind of think back over the reviews you've read in English of books, the precise observation of everyday, I think just recently I was reading Catherine Ann Porter, and Catherine Ann Porter has this remarkable ability to make children seem like children. Like there's this great description of maybe a 4-year-old boy who comes out wearing his pajamas, and he puts his hand into his pocket and he takes out these peanuts that have probably been there for a while, and he's just kind of eating the peanuts, and then he comes over and leans on his father's lap or something like that. And it's just so, just a few sentences, but it captures something very precisely right about this kid. That's something you just don't see in Japanese writing. That's not what people care about. That's not what people look for. And I mean, there are exceptions. There are writers who do that and do it very well. But that's not really what people value. So I think it's there. Like these kinds of, the basic things that people look for in literature, just not the same. And that is huge, because you can't edit that into a book. You can't edit that out of a book, right? If a book, like the thing that makes it great, is connected to its being maudlin, there's just nothing you can do. And yet, if you are somebody who loves, say in my case, I read a lot of Japanese literature, and for me, a lot of these things I'll read and I'll think, wow, this is the most fantastic book I've read in a decade. But if you translate it, it probably won't be the most fantastic book that most people have read in a decade in English yet. But if you keep doing it for 20 years, maybe it will be. So I mean, this is the kind of bind that I think translators working from traditions as different as Japanese and Chinese, Korean find themselves in.
Liz, do you have any comments on that?
Well, I actually had a question for Michael, which is that one of the things that comes up with us is the choices that what from Japanese is published into English and in the US, and there is a perception, I think, that the crime from Japan is particularly violent, that there is quite often a perverse element to those things. And I wondered, from your kind of reading kind of genuinely in Japan, as it were, whether that is representative of Japanese literature, or whether that is just what the West is choosing to have from Japan, and whether there's, those kind of very broad generalizations about what people expect from Japanese books translated into English have any kind of validity at all? Or
I mean, there is definitely, in terms of crime fiction, not mysteries, but crime fiction, and particularly in the case of Japan, crime fiction written by women.
Yeah.
Right. There's an interesting, exactly where that comes from, why it's true. I'm not sure. That's an interesting question. I think it's definitely there, but I do also think that publishers, let's just say in the U.S., I don't know about Britain, but in the U.S. do have this kind of, we've seen that this works, let's find exactly the same thing and do it again. And then let's find exactly the same.
I think that's completely fair. I mean, that's what is happening with Scandinavian crime fiction.
Yeah.
It's a thing that is,
right. And it Murakami is a great example, right? I remember the day after a piece by Ogawa Yoko, translated by Stephen Snyder, I think, was published in The New Yorker, I got all these calls from publishers saying, do you think Ogawa Yoko is the next Murakami Haruki?
Yeah.
And I, of course, said, oh, yes, definitely, absolutely. And in fact, I think she is the next bad, slightly worse Murakami Haruki. I don't really like her.
We published both of them, so.
I don't like her very much. But the thing is that Murakami Haruki was not Murakami Haruki until he became Murakami Haruki. And so if you try and publish the next Murakami Haruki, you're just gonna get something that's sort of like Murakami Haruki, but not as good. Whereas if you publish something that's totally different, you're gonna get something that's totally different, which is what people actually will want probably more in the long term.
Yeah.
So I think the self-reinforcing publishers just kind of fixation on very narrow. It's sort of like instead of trying to open the window and let in a breeze, they drill a hole in the wall and just try and suck in the air through the hole.
Yeah. Maybe on that note, I'll open to questions from the floor. Does anyone have anything that you want to ask?
Quick question about the different markets, because Michael touched on how few of his books actually are selling, even though he's doing great translations. So, and I'm just thinking about how publishing has shifted so much, especially with these two big, huge East Asian literary traditions, and just that it seems extraordinary. There is so much good contemporary fiction in Japan as well that's being produced, and very little of it is getting out there, and I just wondered what you thought the reason for that was, really, in terms of publishing trends. I know there's obviously we've got a huge focus on China here, but why does that necessarily have to be exclusive? Anyway, this is a question from me as an editor.
Unfortunately, I'm not really sure why more doesn't get published, other than the fact that it's just so hard. There are a lot of last year I was at BCLT for the summer program, and BCLT, the British Centre for Literary Translation, right, has this summer. They call it a summer school. It's not really a summer school. It's more like a summer translators get together and have a great time, and it was just an incredible experience working with translators, people who are just starting out as translators, want to be translating more. And it really made me realize in a very visceral way how many people there are out there who are interested in translating more Japanese fiction, who have extraordinary capabilities as readers and as translators. I kind of think maybe this is a fairly new thing, that we just have a kind of growing body of people who are able to do this now, so that maybe, when I was an undergrad, there weren't very many people around me. I don't think I started translating as an undergrad, and I didn't know anybody who was interested in translating Japanese literature. Now among my students I teach, right, among my students, everyone's interested in translation. So I think that's part of it, is that there's a kind of shift now towards being interested in translation, so that we have more people who are interested in translation, who are kind of starting to come to editors and publishers and say, you know what, I'd like to do this. So finally publishers are becoming aware of just how much good stuff is being published in Japan, right? So it's not that the stuff wasn't there before, there just weren't as many channels, or there wasn't as much of a kind of groundswell of interest pushing knowledge about Japanese fiction in Japan up to the level where it'd reach into the consciousness of editors and publishers. Does this make sense? In other words, there's some kind of broad shift, I think, in terms of interest in translation that's making people more aware of what's happening in Japan. And I think, Japanese fiction right now is incredibly interesting, is really different, but viewed in a kind of world literature context, really quite cutting edge. Was that an answer, a sort of reasonable answer to your question?
Pretty much just the exact same thing applies for Chinese. And also the same BCLT course we're all here, this is totally incestuous, was put on in China twice by Penguin, and Valerie were there, and Kate, and I went, and it also was a wonderful experience. And I think everything you just said applies to China.
Does anyone on the discussion panel here have any experience in 16th century Chinese literary Chinese?
Don't look at me.
Oh, I was going to say, if you do, my wife would like to talk to you. Okay.
No, unfortunately, I only do contemporary stuff. I leave all the actual good literature for other. Yeah. Oh, in the interest of raising the general level of knowledge and understanding of Chinese literature, before you can leave, you can't leave until you've taken a copy of this magazine. And there's lots of them, and I've been carrying them all day, so please don't go without taking one.
Yeah, one more question here.
What kind of interest in market do you think there would be for some of the classical Chinese literature, such as the Ming period, for today's markets? It's very different than the Maudlin. It's a lot more. There's a lot of interesting stuff that's been overlooked since the communist period, because it just simply has fallen into such disuse, literary forms. Do you think there is a market for this as well?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think, because in Penguin we publish a very large classics list, and increasingly in the classics we're aware that we've pretty much done the English language now. And increasingly my colleagues in London are turning to other parts of the world. And yes, I think it's not going to be ever a massive market, but I think it's big enough that we're certainly very interested in looking into doing. I personally, I mean, I met an academic a couple of years ago who told me about a Ming, just a short Ming essay that he'd come across that he wants to translate, which was called 100 Reasons Why I Hate My Wife. And I just thought this sounded gorgeous. And so I went to him and said, yeah, sure. And he said, great, can you get me a copy? I was like, from where precisely am I going to find a copy of this document? So, I mean, I think there's some wonderful, esoteric, rich, interesting stuff out there. I'm just not an expert, so I need to rely on people who know things and, you know.
I'm the wife you want to talk to.
Fair enough.
Are there one more question over here?
It's just a quick question for Eric. Is you said you have been an editor, and you also been a translator. And what's the like your bottom line to as an editor to see there's another better translation?
I'm sorry. What's the my what
like,
is an editor?
When you're editing something and you have different opinions with the other translator, and what's your bottom line to convince yourself like the other translation is better, or you just give up the bottom line? Above that line, you agree with that translator, and below that, you just say just like just leave it. I will do that myself.
Yeah. I like all sort of failed ideals. Translation is sort of famously a whatever it is. I'm not even going to repeat the cliche. You end up making decisions based on practical considerations rather than sort of high-flown artistic ideals. So particularly with this magazine, both issues have been produced under severe time constraint with limited resources, and so we've erred on the side of we wished we didn't have to do that, but to hell with it, there it goes. So ideally, I think as the magazine matures, it's in sort of a trial publication period right now. As it matures, we'll be able to start working 1 or 2 issues in advance, and then we'll have much more leeway to sort of say, yes, this meets our standards, no, this doesn't meet our standards, and to really spend some time with translators saying, this almost meets our standards, could you take it back and work on it in such and such a way? That hasn't really been possible so far, but I do think we'll get there. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I'll shut up about this in a second. I forgot to mention that everybody in here is is here. So all the writers and the poets in this magazine are here in London. So you may see them, or you may have already seen them, or maybe after reading their story, you will go see them. Sorry, I'll stop.
Are there any more questions? Okay, a few minutes. We're going to have a reception. There's wine at the back, so I hope you'll take the opportunity to stay around and talk to our panelists. But before we close, I wanted to ask Bryony to make an announcement.
Crouch down slightly. Thank you, Kate, very much for letting me piggyback off. Oh, that'd be better. Thanks. Not that tall, but actually that's tough. Just wanted to say, Kate, thanks very much for letting me piggyback off of this. I just wanted to announce that today we're launching the 3rd annual Harville-Secker Young Translators Prize. We started a couple years ago with Spanish, and last year we did Arabic, and both of the winning translators have gone on to get great work and great exposure, in addition to £1,000, which is always nice. But we're really excited about the network that they have built up from being part of our prize. And this year we will be doing Chinese. So I won't talk a lot about Harville-Secker because you've already heard from Liz, our publishing director, so you know what we do. But the judges, in short, are Nikki Harmon, who's around here somewhere there, and myself, and Tash Ah, author. And we will be considering translations of a short story called The Wig by Han Dong, who's also here, if not immediately here, he's here at the fair. Yes, but he is around the London Book Fair, which is great. And so basically the entry deadline is the 27th of July this year, and there are leaflets scattered around the place. Please spread the word, even if you're not actually eligible to enter for yourselves. But it is, so the 27th of July, and the website is youngtranslatorsprize.com. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'd like to thank our panelists, Michael, Joe, Eric and Liz. And thank you all for coming along and for your questions.